Reverend Dr. David Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, this bill warrants the government a tiny pair of flip-flops. It is a U-turn, but with a small U. It is a tentative first step. As my colleague Dr. Megan Woods noted, it is like the first steps of a child, and only a shame we haven't got a Polaroid camera here to catch that moment when that first tentative step is taken. We support it. A tiny pair of flip-flops for that tiny first step should be issued from this side of the House. It is a way for the government to signal that maybe one day maybe, but let's not rush, it may develop a plan to transition to a low-carbon economy. It may signal a tentative, tiny, incremental signal that it wishes to increase the value of New Zealand's economy over time by stepping into the high-value space and away from what we have always done. Hopefully, in the future, they're thinking, hopefully there's another way, but they're not really signalling in any strong or assertive way that they're going in that direction. Let's not forget that the emissions trading scheme, when it was introduced, was the first all sectors, all gases emissions trading scheme in the whole world. New Zealand once had ambition. New Zealand once wanted to lead in the transition to a high-value economy that was low carbon. We wanted to lead. But now we have a government that stepped away from that, that said, no, let's sit with the status quo. Let's look after the entrenched interests. Let's not let the costs lie where they fall. Let's subsidise polluters. Well, here we have a small step saying we're not going to step away from the $25 cap. We're not actually going to have a real market. We're not going to step away from intensive style agriculture. We're not going to have a real cap and trade scheme. We're not going to put a cap on it, for goodness sake. Let's have a cap and trade scheme without a track. We don't really believe in the market because then we wouldn't be able to support existing interests. This is a government that is taking a tentative first step, a tentative signal that is saying one day we might send some stronger signals that we really believe this stuff. But we will be supporting it because those first steps, it's important to support them. It's important to get behind. They may be a precursor to something more significant. Look, we know, of course, on this side of the House, the way to get to that more significant step is to change the government. That is the plain and simple way. These few tiny tentative steps are certainly not a big sprint in the right direction. But this government seems no longer ambitious for New Zealand. They seem to have lost touch with middle New Zealand, with their aspirations. They seem to have just focused now only on the interests of the wealthiest few. And we've seen that, of course, in the Panama Papers. We've seen a budget that does very little to address the increasing gap between the cost of schooling and the money that comes in from taxpayers to support it. We've seen a cap in this budget announced just before on the operations grant. And we know that the real effect of that is that parents will be paying more donations, quote unquote, voluntary donations, to keep schools afloat. That's what this budget means. That's what this budget means for middle New Zealand. It means more costs in schooling. Of course, we know it also means fewer operations. We've seen a health spend that is below the increase in health costs. And here we have, in the space of carbon emissions, again, something that really doesn't go the whole way. It is not even addressing the current issue in a serious fashion. The interesting thing, if you look through the regulatory impact statement, looking at the analysis that the government has done on this, it signals that the cost of this is 0.1% of GDP in 2020. That's the level of ambition, 0.1% in 2020. 8 hours worth of GDP will be sacrificed. 8 hours worth of GDP. That's the signal we're sending as a country. We're prepared to sacrifice 8 hours of GDP to move our country in the right direction. But in fact, it really isn't a sacrifice at all because, of course, we know that as we shift away from that old economy and into the new economy, there are some real advantages that could be taken advantage of. There are some real opportunities, I should say, that can be taken advantage of. But this government just doesn't seem to get that. It doesn't seem to see the opportunity. It seems much more comfortable with managing decline. And of course, we've seen in the last year what has happened to wages in New Zealand. Per person wages in New Zealand, absolutely flat last year. absolutely flat. As costs rise, there is no wage increase for 43% of New Zealanders last year, and across the board, per person, we have seen absolutely no increase in wages. The only thing pushing our economy along right now is immigration. It's the only thing that is pushing our economy along. And that's not a plan. That is simply not a plan. Here we have, from the government, little timid steps. This is not a government that will push us in the right direction. As my colleague Grant Robertson has said, this budget is applying a sticking plaster. It's like applying a sticking plaster to a compound fracture. That is what this budget is. And I don't think he's understating it. In this area, it's much the same. We've got a serious issue where we need to transition New Zealand's economy to the high-value future that's on offer, and instead we're getting further and further and further behind our Western competitors, who are out there in front, developing the intellectual property, rewarding their innovators, and seeing the opportunity and grasping it. They're not stuck in the past like New Zealand seems to be under this government. They're not protecting vested interests. They're not protecting those who are already mega rich. They are out looking for the brighter future, looking to reward those who innovate, looking to make sure the incentives are right for those who innovate to take their economies forward so they can afford the kind of healthcare that they would want, so they can afford the type of education that they would want, so they can afford a secure society with a good rule of law. All of those things that taxes pay for. But this government, no. They seem content to manage decline. And that is out of line with the aspiration of Middle New Zealand, who actually want to see themselves better off. We know for Middle New Zealand, for example, that proportion of wages that they received under the last Labour government, as the economy grew, which it actually did under the last Labour government by 25% in real terms, 50%, more than 50% of the gains went to the working people. Under this government, it's down to 37%. Just 37% of the returns from the limited gains are going to working people. So that gap between rich and poor is growing. And this government seems, in the emissions trading space, determined to protect entrenched interests. They seem completely unwilling to help shift to the new economy, to the opportunity that is out there for new technologies, Mr. Speaker. So Labor will support this first step, but we can't say that it fixes the ETS, which the government broke. Let's remember, as soon as they got into government, they got rid of the renewable preference for new generation because they weren't comfortable with the thought that fossil fuel plants might not be added to our energy generation mix. They got rid of the target for biofuels, the minimum obligation, which wasn't going to cost the country anymore, but was going to secure a future for the biofuels industry. And then, of course, they diluted the emissions trading scheme. And here we have a small step towards reinstating a small part of it, Mr. Speaker. This is a government that is failing to invigorate the economy. And we've seen also today, of course, in terms of invigorating the economy, another Byzantine grant scheme from Stephen Joyce, which will be about him selecting who gets what for his photo opportunities. They have not simply the gumption to put in place a research and development tax credit scheme like the rest of the world recommends, like the literature recommends. They don't want real innovation. They want to control where the money goes. And isn't that the story of this government? They want to control where the money goes. And it certainly isn't going to Middle New Zealand. Most New Zealanders will not find themselves better off as a result of this budget. Most New Zealanders in the future will not have the opportunities that they could have if this budget and this bill actually moved us towards an innovative new economy. If it gave the right signals about shifting away from our old dependency on carbon and rewarded those in the agricultural sector, rewarded those in the forestry sector, rewarded those in the tech sector, rewarded anybody who wants to innovate and look toward the new world. Instead, they seem intent on preserving existing interests, Mr. Speaker, the interests of the wealthiest few, and that's the story of this government. Mr. Speaker, we will, as I said again, be supporting this, but on the basis that it is a tiny, tentative first step. It is 0.1% of GDP in 2020 that is up for grabs here. The opportunity, of course, is much bigger if we were to send a stronger signal than this government is prepared to send, Mr. Speaker. The majority of our emissions are in agriculture. This measure here is a tiny first step, Mr. Speaker. While we'll be supporting it, we could be doing so much more as a country, and that would provide great opportunity for New Zealanders in the future.